1995 saw Nintendo release 4 Game Boy game packs under the Arcade Classics banner, essentially a series of compilation cartridges, each containing 2 arcade titles from the early 1980s and other stuff. Arcade Classics 1 comprises 2 classic Atari arcade titles, Asteroids and Missile Command. More specifically, this is a compilation of 2 previously released Game Boy ports of the aforementioned games, both of which were originally released by Accolade and developed by the Code Monkeys. Now, Asteroids has already been covered in a prior video review years ago, and that review still applies to the version seen here more or less, since it's not all that different. But in any event, here's a quick primer on both games. Asteroids, a game where you clear the screen of asteroids and try not to crash into anything, is a solid conversion of the arcade title that has more in common with the Atari 7800 version of the game, with its spinning asteroids and slightly more detailed bits. Now, if you prefer a visual presentation that's more in line with the original vector-based arcade graphics, then you have an option to do that, and it's a neat little inclusion that doesn't otherwise change the gameplay all that much. But when you have spinning space rocks with surface craters as a default, why go the other way? Especially when this alternate graphical style comes at the cost of the 2-player modes from the single release. Nonetheless, it controls fairly well, has multiple skill settings, and is as playable and fun as any competent version of Asteroids that I've played. I don't care for the musical jingles they tossed in, but other than that, this is probably one of the better Code Monkey conversions in the series. On the flip side, you have Missile Command, which is a fairly simplified version of the arcade game that actually makes sense on the Game Boy. Instead of 3 missile launchers, you only have 2, each tied to a button while you use the D-pad to move the cursor fairly slowly, which is a fairly reasonable compromise all things considered. This is a fairly playable and competent version of Missile Command on the go that starts off a bit slow, but does pick up speed and challenge along the way. I like the changing backgrounds every couple levels depicting different famous cities. It's a rather nice touch. Also, much like Asteroids, there's some additional musical jingles that aren't all that good, but they're short and not too detrimental. Unlike Asteroids, you do have 2-player alternating play on a single Game Boy, so that's something. Anyway, those games are pretty much the same as their standalone Game Boy releases, so if you have any of those, then you already have these. However, what this compilation brings to the table that the individual releases do not have is Super Game Boy compatibility, which means fancy borders made to resemble the arcade cabinets, as well as slightly unique color schemes and more colorful title screens. This might not seem like much, but enabling the classic style in Asteroids not only gives you the vector-based looking asteroids, but also turns the screen black so that it almost looks like the arcade original on a Super Game Boy border. Unfortunately, the space craters get white space, and that's lame. Overall, if you already have the individual releases, beyond having both games on one cart, there's no real reason to pick this one up unless you have a Super Game Boy laying around and really want to play spinning asteroids in white space. But otherwise, if you enjoy Asteroids or Missile Command or both games, you'll find a couple decent conversions on the Game Boy that, while not quite arcade perfect for obvious reasons, are still pretty respectable iterations. That and spinning rocks with surface craters, rock bro, and stuff.